All right, well, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tonight for this. I want to bring a short, informative speech tonight on politics, but in particular, I want to talk about parties in America, and in particular, I want to talk about third parties in America. Many of you know that in part of my background, I had the great privilege when I got out of high school of working in the White House. I was actually assigned to the White House Communications Agency, and so I worked in the White House under President Ronald Reagan. It was an exciting time. And I guess, you know, growing up, I didn't think much about politics. I had a good history professor and a good political professor in high school, so I kind of enjoyed it, and had it in my mindset to be a registered voter and all that. But working in the White House and living in D.C. for a while was a real exciting experience. So it was no surprise that a few years ago when I decided to go back to school to get my degree that I chose political science as my minor. And so we took several classes in political science because I was interested in how politics work, how does the government work. I did not realize how many classes there are that you can take on political science, entire classes around specific amendments and politics and different things. And so it was a great class, I really enjoyed it. But one of the things that I encountered actually in a history class kind of caught me off guard. My history professor talked about a little bit about the history of parties in America. And he brought to my attention the importance of third parties. And tonight I want to show you how third parties have always played an important role in American politics. And there are several things that I want us to look at. We're going to look at why third parties are necessary, how they're formed, and we're going to look at their role today, and we're also going to look at some of the obstacles for forming them. So I want to start by considering first the recognition of parties in American government. Where it begins in American government. Our founding fathers were divided in the Constitutional Convention. Starts right off the bat. We had two parties, even though they weren't officially parties, when the Constitutional Convention met. You had the Federalists and you had the Anti-Federalists. Right off the bat, there was a disagreement. We're going to have a big federal government, or we're going to have a small federal government. That's the question we're still asking today. And most people would probably classify themselves as big government, small government. Some of us might even say no government, and those are the anarchists. But for the most part, there's the larger government or the small government. Do the people have more rights, or does the government have more rights? Right off the bat, our country was divided. And one of the things that they gave us to help us choose a president was the Electoral College. A lot of confusion over the Electoral College, but the Electoral College basically prevents the mass population from electing a president. And it requires, in fact, that the president be elected from representatives from all the states. Now, in order to win the presidency, you have to win a true majority of the Electoral College. This was probably the Founding Fathers' first mistake, because really what they required was that only two people could ever potentially run for president. In order to get that full majority, if you have more than two people running, then you have a situation where you could have a runoff, or you could have to go to the Senate to have someone be elected. Washington himself, our first president, expressed grave fears over partisanship in America. He recognized that partisanship could eventually become a problem. And so George Washington said, I fear what will happen if America descends into partisanship politics. He was elected the first president of the United States, and he was not going to seek a second term, but he saw parties beginning to form. When he saw those parties beginning to form, then he ran for a second office to try and prevent that from happening, which of course he was not successful, and we had the two parties formed. So how were these new parties formed? Well, the first year's party formed from in-party splits. You had the foes in favor of the government, you had the Federalists, and then you had the Anti-Federalists. In the later years, parties were formed around singular ideas. You'd have an entire party that would form around one idea. The Abolitionist Party formed, a Liberty Party formed around abolition. They wanted to do away with slavery. The American Party was an anti-immigration party. So they would form around one issue. They usually couldn't get a lot of support because it was just a one-issue thing. Lincoln's Republican Party was actually a hybrid of both. The Whigs were divided into the Southern and Northern Republicans, and Lincoln won the Northern nomination from the Northern Whigs, and he became the nomination for the, at that time, Republican Party for the presidency. And he won the presidency without ever running in a single Southern state. He was able to achieve enough Electoral College votes that he won the presidency without ever having to campaign in a Southern state. Well, so that's how parties are formed, and a little bit why they started, but third parties are still needed today. Third parties are actually needed today to keep us from having a tyranny of existing parties that George Washington himself feared. Ross Perot in 1992 and 96 challenged both parties, and he ran on a campaign of fiscal responsibility. He was the last time that a third-party candidate was actually invited to a presidential debate. In the Bush-Gore elections, that was tainted by supposed third-party confusion, especially on the Florida ballots. Everybody wanted to blame the third-party candidate, but you can't blame the candidate because they didn't know how to write up a ballot. And then not only that, today you have the Constitution Party, which is the third largest party in terms of active registered voter membership. So third parties are still active today. There are three main obstacles to forming a successful third party today. The first is the 12th Amendment, which links the presidency and the vice presidency. Today, when we elect a president, his vice president from the same party goes with him. Originally, that wasn't the case. So you would have two different parties in the two chief positions of power. We don't have that today. Second, there's no federal uniformity for ballot access. Makes it hard for a third-party candidate to get on the ballot. And then thirdly, ballot laws that are passed by the two controlling parties. So third parties have always played a place in the history of America, and they're very, very, very important. But in order for us to keep that and acknowledge that, in order to let them do what they're supposed to do, we have to be willing to look beyond the two major parties and their candidates. Here's a quote that I'll close with. To change government, you have to change the way you vote. And I would add this, you also have to change the way you view parties in America. As long as our allegiance lies with a party and not with principle, we're always going to have a problem. All right? So third parties have a great role in the history of America, and they'll continue to have a great role. Thank you for coming. God bless.
Amen.